everyone. Welcome to Your Bytes, Your Rights, a weekly interdisciplinary discussion and podcast about data ownership, digital rights, and your privacy. In episode 38, we talk about invalidating the Facebook business model. I'm Jeff Jokish, founder of Privacy Plan and a vocal data privacy researcher. I live at the intersection of privacy and data about privacy. I'm here with my co-host, as always, Christian K. Meyer, managing partner at Sustany Capital. Chris runs a venture firm focused on blockchain solutions. And as a former software developer and lawyer, he's been working on data rights, the future of money, and recreating reality consensus. Tell us about that, Chris.
Well, what irks me the most about companies like Facebook and Google and others, they're kind of intellectually lazy by deploying this kind of what they call ad-based model, even though most people probably caught on to the fact that what they're selling is not app or is not ads, it's behavioral change of sorts. So what I call social engineering as a service, but it should go without saying that you have unlimited options as a company to make money, specifically if you have the attention, the wherewithal, the platform, the technology to intermediate human collaboration at scale globally, right? And so any child can come up with a business model that's more ethical and more useful to humanity at large. So that's what irks me the most, because it's an excuse to say, well, they have to make money somehow. Well, then put a couple of somehows on the table and discuss that, while also accounting for the externalities that your current business model is producing on a daily basis. And that has been bothering me for well over a decade. And the things that we're going to talk about today, I think, identify that finally a couple of regulators internationally are kind of creeping up to that fact, even though it's still very much incomplete.
Sure. And I think those externalities are becoming more and more obvious to not just regulators, not just politicians and legislators, but consumers in general. And maybe it's been a little obvious for a while, but they're starting to act as though those externalities matter to them. Well, today, Chris, we've got Alan Rodriguez with us, and we're going to talk about the recent ruling that you mentioned here from the European Data Protection Board in favor of NOYB and against Meta. What is that decision and why is it important? Let me give you a little bit of background before we introduce Alan. So the European Data Protection Board ruled that the European privacy law, GDPR, doesn't allow the meta platforms such as Instagram and Facebook to use their terms of service as a justification for allowing personalized advertising. The decision is actually a long time coming, because it was actually filed by Max Schrems and NOYB the day the GDPR became applicable back in May 25th of 2018. So like 4.5 years ago. And a couple of things about the decision, right? It's not actually quite final yet. There's a lot of sort of process and stuff, just like we have a lot of litigation and things that go on in the United States. The Irish DPC is actually the one that sort of has to rule against Meta and Facebook and Google and a lot of the big tech companies. And they actually initially ruled on this in favor of Meta a while back. And then it sort of went into appeal mode. And now the European Data Protection Committee has essentially said, no, that's wrong. They can't do that. And they've sent it back to the Irish DPC to correct their decision. But the chances that we think the chances that Meta is going to be able to get out of this are very slim indeed. And apparently rarely are those things overturned. So with that sort of as a background, let's talk to Alan. Alan, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit further and give us your take on this decision?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Alan Rodriguez. I'm the founder of the Data Freedom Foundation. We are a nonprofit with the mission of making sure that humans control technology instead of technology controlling humans. And we're not just an advocacy group. We are developing the technology to do this. What's interesting about this whole invalidating of the ad business model is that if you roll the clock back to around 1994, all the way through about 2012, we had more than a dozen standards bodies who were working on methods to attach contracts to data everywhere it moves. It was really interesting that Facebook is, we're talking about Facebook, because in 2012, all dozen or half a dozen of these different standards bodies around the world who were working on this, they all stopped working on it in 2012. And two interesting things happened that year. GDPR, a draft of it people could read, was released that January. And then I think around March, a few months later, Facebook went to its first IPO, the third largest in US history at that time. We haven't really dug into exactly what happened in that moment, but there was a moment in time where the trajectory of the internet went a certain way, as opposed to the standards bodies that were working to attach contracts to data so we can control how other people use it. And so it's just fascinating to me that we're back here now, right? Like a decade later, we've let this business model play out, and it doesn't work. It's too dangerous to society and to human beings. And I think there's now an awakening, right? And that's my take on it.
That's really interesting. I like the perspective, Alan, and I'm in agreement. It seems to me that we've gone down this road of not just data without contracts, but data without protection, and deeply into behavioral advertising, where I'm not sure that there's actually all that much proof other than industry-sponsored research that advertisers even really need behavioral advertising as opposed to really good contextual advertising and other solutions within that vein. Care to comment on that, Chris or Alan?
Well, maybe a little background here. So I taught privacy law in Europe right after leaving law school, and then incidentally became general counsel of one of the first internet service providers. So once in a while I would go down into our call center and repeat what I had said months ago, as in when people call you and they want information about their spouse's internet connectivity, do not give them anything, right? So, but today we kind of reversed this model in a way by, oh, if you want to have that, well, just create an advertiser account and we'll give it to you in granularity, because you can actually pinpoint, again, and this might be slightly anecdotal, so if anybody in the audience knows better, raise your hand, but you can actually pinpoint a singular person if you refine your targeting closely enough. If it's just, what was it, Jeff? We need 3 data points to identify a person with 87% accuracy. You got 4, it's getting up to 90 some, and you got 5, then you're basically close to 100%, right? And so that's,
yeah, it depends a little bit upon what the data points are, but that's pretty close to reality. You get a bunch of data points and you can identify virtually anybody when you've got these huge profiles, companies like Oracle and Axiom and Google have on us.
Yeah, that's a big part of the problem, right? Because it's not just the data that you're creating on a platform, but it's also the data that these platforms buy and then attach to your behavior and carry that forward and create more copies of that then kind of get lost in the shuffle ultimately, where they probably don't even necessarily know who that individual is per se, more so that they can sell this identifier as an ad tech technology to then affect behavioral change. And that's what really this is all about. That's why, even though we talk a lot about privacy, for me, this is all about human agency, as in self-determination. You're actually messing with humans' ability to make independent decisions, because you have this information overload on them that they often don't even realize that they have certain biases and or that it's this particular platform that they're engaging with actually knows more about them than they know about themselves. And the usual metaphor here that I always have in my head is like, if and when we actually have self-driving cars, I don't expect that my self-driving car decides where to go and how to get there. But yet, that's kind of what we have allowed in the world of digital platforms to happen. And I totally didn't answer your question, but went on to my usual rant. So maybe direct your question at Alan instead.
Yeah, Alan,
Yeah,
you should take
I'm
that.
happy to hop in. I mean, you know, you know, Chris, you said earlier that you think there are other alternatives to the contextual. You said this as well.
Yeah, jump closer to your mic, Alan.
Sorry, I'll have my earbuds.
Okay.
So, I'll speak louder is what I'll do.
Okay.
No problem. So, to me, this is about how we control the technology around us. It's about the agency issue, right, Chris? So, the problem that we're having, and it's interesting because businesses have the exact same problem, is that we can't share the data with others and control how they use it so it serves our needs, right, while omitting all the other use cases. And because we lack that level to share our data under precise conditions to produce precise responses, everyone's just sort of defaulted to this idea. It's just a necessary evil that when you share your data, right? It's like asking if you're an adult and giving someone your driver's license and they know that they have your age. You don't know. If they want to know you're an adult, they just need a yes or a no answer to that, right? And so when we attach the software or contracts to data, it lets people ask questions and get an answer. It's just everyone, even the data community, this is what we're doing. We're trying to educate the data community that you don't need to just move data around. It's actually kind of irresponsible when you think that we now possess the technology to attach software to it, and thereby controlling who can access it, where they can access it, when they can access it, the questions they can ask of it, how they have to protect it, how can they or can they not share it with others, right? What we need is a standard where we can share the data with others so we get a personalized response, but it's ephemeral. It's like Snapchat. It's like, imagine a data standard that made all data, if you chose it to be like Snapchat. You share it and they can use it for a certain period of time for specific use cases, and then it just disappears, essentially, right? And so there's a reason why these standards bodies were shut down working on this. It's because had they been able to adopt these ideas as standards, the whole Facebook business model wouldn't have ever had a chance to even exist. They simply couldn't have used our data in all the nefarious and sundry ways they've done it, because the technology wouldn't have allowed it.
Right.
And I think this is a fantastic kind of moment for me, because we've been working on this for a decade, watching consumer behavior just drive everything off a cliff, right? And at the same time, we're like, wait, we just need to get this technology out there fast enough. And what I've figured out is businesses have all these same problems of data integrity and quality and trust.
Yeah, the one thing that always amazes me, I'm in so many different working groups on this particular topic of what I call the agency attribution layer to digital technologies, which a lot of people call a digital identity, which is kind of an unfortunate metaphor in a way, because you can't really compute on that. But the larger point there being, though, is a lot of these groups don't pay attention to the emerging standards that are being rolled out. And the way I use standards here, by the way, is what is actually being adopted in the real world that you basically are being forced to adopt yourself. And they are specifically for those people who have an iPhone. Just open up your iPhone native wallet, and then you should see a plus sign on the upper right hand corner. And then you'll notice that now there's 3 states now where they allow you to import your digitally native driver's license. So Arizona, Colorado, and Maryland, and then Louisiana was actually the first to roll this out. And this particular instrument follows a particular ISO standard that you can look up. It's ISO IEC 18 or 13, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter. You'll find it if you Google it. But so the larger point there being is, and that's a comment I've been making for 5 years now, if, when, where we have the digitally native credentials to attach personal identifiable data, information to any type of transaction only upon a narrow legal requirement, i.e. a warrant, then doing anything else should actually be illegal, should be warranted surveillance. And that's that. Because to me, it's not just the government that requires a warrant. For me, that requirement extends to private companies. And the reason why it extends to private companies, and here I'm talking specifically in the United States, is because of this total ill-begotten judgment by the Supreme Court about the third-party doctrine, which basically means that anything that was ever recorded digitally can be just pulled by a government agency from the past into the future, and by that virtue, you don't need a warrant for anything anymore. So it's completely circumventing the rule of law. And that there is no like riots on the streets because of that is just a matter of people not understanding that by and large. They don't understand that we are living under a complete surveillance state where the surveillance can be just pulled on you any given point in time, used against you. And you only notice that once you're a victim of that, once you're being disenfranchised. Otherwise, you just live your life. But again, once you notice that, it's just simply too late.
Yeah. What do you guys think about notice and choice? It seems to me that the whole notice and choice regime doesn't work. But if we get rid of that, I don't see that like pushing the onus onto the companies or regulations really solves it, right? I agree with both of you when you talk about human agency. We have to make that work in some way. But what's the mechanism? Can we say that data should only go to first parties, that there shouldn't be third parties like data brokers? Or can we say that the data should really be like zero party data, that it only stays with me? And so, for instance, if we want to have a behavioral advertising model, my data has to flow from me somehow. I don't know, maybe it stays on the edge, and then the behavioral ad gets rendered on my device for me just in that moment, something like that. How does this work?
So you talked about consent. So one could say that's our core mission, is creating consent technology. We've been working with cryptographers that have also been working on this idea of consent technology for over a decade. I think that it's absurd to say, I'm going to try and be polite here, that consent is a checkbox. My definition of consent does not even come close to that. So, you know, if the choice is you either exist or don't exist, that's your choice. That's not a choice. So there's no choice. So I'm not sure how it's consent when there's no choice. That's a big part of the definition of consent. And then the other part is revocation. Where's the checkbox that I can uncheck it later?
Yeah.
It doesn't exist, does it? Right. So, you know, and this goes back to the idea of, you know, the idea of controlling the data, finding a different way at the data level of moving it around, controlling it, because that was fundamental. When we went to set out to solve this problem, we actually put some thought into the definition of consent. And it's clearly, there needs to be choice, and there needs to be revocation. And when you take that revocation into account and start thinking about, well, how do you solve that problem? There's actually not too many ways to do it, is the reality. But that's it's just lazy. You know, there was a business model to be had. The technology and the standards didn't exist to stop it. So money just rushed in.
Yeah, and ultimately, Jeff, sorry. Ultimately, also these laws are just written by people who are misinformed about the state of technology by and large, right? So as in, like my usual example for that is this kind of quaint request by GDPR or now CCPA of the right to be forgotten ignores the fact that nothing that was ever digitally observed can be forgotten. right? It's next to impossible. At the moment of creation, this data is being duplicated and distributed. And as soon as that happens because of legacy technology, let's call it database solutions, they're unprotectable, they're being accessed by people that shouldn't have access, they're being duplicated, exported. And at that point in time, this data will basically always exist in one way or another. So that's why the correct request is as a human being, I have the unalienable right not to be surveilled, period, not to be surveilled by a government entity or by a private entity. I don't know why we even need to have that discussion. That seems to be unquestionable, because if you imagine the reverse scenario, then you also should be agreeing to someone just milli-vanilli putting a camera into your bedroom and just streaming that all the time, right? So that's basically what we let happen by adopting the surveillance technology out of quote unquote convenience. There's nothing convenient about that, right?
Yeah. Well, guys, I think that the consent spam that we have now and this yes or no choice, I think Alan's absolutely right that it doesn't work, right? And it's not actual consent. But if we're leaving it up to the organizations that are giving us this choice, I don't know how exactly we can standardize that process or make those choices perfect. To some extent, I like what Apple's done with the privacy labels, right? The nutrition labels. Maybe that's a little bit toward what kind of solution we need. But what would be great, and I don't know how we implement it. I don't know if it's an organizational thing, if it's legislation, if it's platform specific. But what would be great is if consumers could actually get some sort of a pop-up that showed them the actual trade-offs that they were making, right? And then made a meaningful choice. Okay, I'm going to give up this piece of information and that piece of information, and I'm going to get X, Y, and Z, right? And now I can actually make an informed consent decision. But we're not getting those kinds of pieces of information and making those kinds of informed choices, right? And then be able to opt back out of it if I made the wrong decision and feel like that's not the one I want to make, right?
Yeah, so what you're describing is the ability to tightly tailor the uses of the data to others. That's what's missing.
Right.
And so, you want to be able to give it to them for specific use cases, for specific time periods, for specific people, for specific geographies, to ask specific questions.
Right.
That's what I think is missing is a standard for that. This is what we've been working a decade on, and this is why this nonprofit exists, is to create that standard out in the world. And we're not just creating it; we're actually building the technology, and we're selling it to businesses. We figured out that businesses have all these same problems with managing their own data. What's the quality? Where has it been? Who's touched it? What's its lineage? What's its what's its quality? Can we quantify its quality? Can we make these decisions off of this data? Right? When you attach software to data everywhere it moves, it solves all those problems too. And so our strategy is to acknowledge that these fundamental problems with data, they are both a societal problem and they're a business problem. And that if we can tackle it at that level, we can truly solve this problem. Because when you tell businesses, hey, we have this new way of monetizing, we call this process of tailoring the uses of the data, right? How as a consumer, we might say, you can use this data just for this one reason, for this one solution. I'm going to be here for 5 minutes, give me offers of coupons, whatever it is you want to have. The technology to do that is the same technology that one would use to solve all these data quality and lineage and provenance problems within businesses.
Yeah. I wanted to buy some new tires, and I went to Goodyear. I think it was their website, and I thought I might buy some stuff there. So for like 15% off, I gave them my email address, right? and now I've got like like spam for like 2 months on my cell phone because I was thinking about buying something there, but I never did because their prices ended up being more than I wanted to pay, and I bought my tires elsewhere. But I can't, I can't.
Yes.
I probably
Right.
can opt out of that, right? But finding how to opt out was harder than it, it took more energy than I put into it so far, right?
Mhm. Right.
And that's just an example. I'm not trying to finger, point them out in particular, right? But that's the problem with consumer consent in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean it's a farce. It's not like anybody in their right mind don't expect anybody to read these very long privacy and otherwise messages pertaining to someone's terms and conditions. Right? That's just unrealistic. So in a way, we should have dispensed with that a long time ago, in favor of some um, temporary messages where this data is being used to profile someone, so against someone, to alert them at that very moment, because that's the only time it's relevant. And so there it's also important, in my opinion, to always redirect from, it's not the data. Data by itself is not the new oil. It doesn't have any value per se. Your ability to form a profile and then within the context of usually a platform redirect someone's attention and then ultimately redirect someone's activity, that is what has value, right? So the data itself doesn't have any value. So it's very important to frame the discussion in this particular light. Not that we shouldn't go after people that store this data and that sell this data. I think that's kind of self-explaining, but this is a different topic altogether. That's the topic that we need to establish and where we don't even have a discussion yet. It's like, what is the actual right to any of the data that's being produced by me? And my default position would always be, I have property rights. I have property rights to anything that I create, including what I create digitally. And unless I state it in writing otherwise, you don't get to do anything with that, right? Unless there's a specific contract in place that I consented to actively, there is no reason for you to duplicate that or even store that. And again, I think it's underappreciated how much of our daily activity is intermediated using digital solutions. And the unfortunate thing here is really that we're missing a huge opportunity here, as in the continued survival of our species is based on our ability to effectively collaborate. And that's what's really being undermined at scale. So moving away from like the individual violations to actually seeing what is the violation on society at large. It's tremendous. If we just go from like the lowest hanging denominator, as in just counting the hours that are being wasted for optimizing time on site considerations by engaging with these platforms, i.e. just wasting someone's time, ultimately, that's what that amounts to. If you just assign the lowest minimum wage to that, for a person wasting their time, this exceeds Facebook profit in every given day by one order of magnitude. But we don't even have that discussion yet, right? And that's a discussion I ultimately want to have yesterday, right? That's what I want to fix. My 20-year goal is to fix that, put Mark Zuckerberg into prison where he belongs and everybody else who supported him in that effort. And that goes back to, there's an ongoing shareholder lawsuit that most people don't know about. When Facebook paid this $4.9 billion fine to the FTC, 4.8 billion of that was, according to Politico, I'm just citing someone else, it's not my own research, was actually paid to keep Mark Zuckerberg out of prison, right? To essentially not assign personal liability to violating this dissent decree. That's what really needs to happen, right? Because corporations don't change their behavior. They don't have behavior. Who changes behavior is people. Right? So we need to change the behavior of certain people in order for us to see actual change in the world, change of these platforms' behavior.
Yeah. Well, I do think, Chris, you've got a really interesting point about the productivity loss attributed as an externality to social media. And I also think that the ownership of our digital dust is crucial, but the ownership of the interactions between us. So like the information here between all three of us, right? Do we own that, or does YouTube? This fact that we're streaming some of this stuff, does YouTube own the stuff that's going to the YouTube platform, and does Zoom own the stuff that's going here to their platform, or do we own all of this content, right? Um,
Well, to the extent that they're utilizing a commons, which is the World Wide Web, in my opinion, is a commons, to that extent, they don't own anything.
No, I understand. I'm not trying to assign ownership any place, right? The fact that if YouTube was to go away and we didn't have a copy of this, or if they were to somehow claim ownership and we couldn't get it back, right? The fact that like all the Facebook comments between different people, if they weren't backed up, all that collaboration could potentially disappear, right? Think about the collaboration platforms like blanking on them now. If those things were to disappear, or if that content is not yours, if it's theirs, that's a pretty significant externality, right? That's really a problem.
Yeah, you're thinking of like Slack and Telegram and things like that.
Yeah, things like that, right?
And so, yeah, that's a good example, because they are specifically, we should just simply acknowledge that these are synchronous and asynchronous communication technologies, right? So as in, they shouldn't actually know anything about this content. That should be the default position. They should know who's communicating, and specifically not what they're communicating about.
Right. And a lot of times if you're paying for the premium service, they don't, or they shouldn't, right? But if you're not paying, if it's the free version, right, they do, and they often claim ownership, and at least dual ownership of that content.
Yeah, that's just preposterous, right? Mm-hmm. That simply can't be. Again, I'm not saying that these companies don't have the right to make profits. Obviously, that's the overriding objective of any for-profit corporation. What I'm saying is that this particular business model that they're deploying is best case unethical, worst case illegal, but probably somewhere in between and on a spectrum. But first things first, again, I think we don't ever account entirely for all the externalities that these platforms are creating. We're having kind of this very segmented discussions about certain externalities that people are passionate about, like what was it, teenagers hurting themselves because they're spending too much time on TikTok or Instagram or some other social media sharing platforms where everybody's life seems happy but except their own. And that's one externality. But there's so many more externalities that we just take not for granted, but that we are just simply ignoring. Think about the fact that on average, the 100 million people in the United States that are on Facebook spend an hour on Facebook, mostly during business hours. So should we leave it up to the businesses to mitigate the behavior there? Or isn't it the responsibility of those platforms to put in behavioral mechanisms that don't lead to that? Because as a company, there's only so much that you can do and that you want to do. And maybe also sometimes it's furthering a business purpose. I don't want to exclude that. But I think by and large, the externalities to productivity, I think if we measure that, would be enormously negative, right? Would be falling definitely on a less productivity side of the scale.
Yeah. If I can chime in, I think that this isn't getting to the root cause of the problem. For instance, let's give everyone kind of an example. I spent a year talking to hundreds of investors about attaching contracts to data, blah, 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 blah. We can do all these things. We can solve these problems for businesses. And there was always this underlying current that it would apply to consumers as well. So there's all that Pandora's box of, it wasn't just a straight business. It had this other standards thing to it and other parts to it. But what I found fascinating, because I wasn't sure, we had some patents and we were like, what do we do with them? And in about 90, I would say, really in the end, 100% of the cases, in some way or another, either by just not returning phone calls or just being nice or saying politely no. Sometimes I would just be insulted, right, around this idea that we were trying to control the data ourselves. But what ended up happening in these conversations was we would get to a place, and about half the investors, when you'd say, "Oh, we're going to attach contracts to data," their eyes would light up. They'd say, "We can see everyone's data." I mean, they could just think it was raining money from the ceiling in their minds. Okay, and I'm sitting there looking at them. I'm like, "Oh, no. We're doing the exact opposite of this. We're doing this in a way where even we can't surveil the contents of the containers. That's not how the cryptography works. It's impossible for us to even surveil it." And then, a certain percentage of them would be just outright, forward about it. They would say, "Well, what if it's legal for us to surveil the data without people knowing it? We would have a fiduciary responsibility to do that." And they do. Legally, they do. If it's legal for them to do it, then they have to go maximize shareholder value, right? And so the consent environment we have is not by accident. It's engineered. It's engineered consent literally through how the standards bodies were shut down. They were defunded in some manner. I don't know the details, but they all went offline at the exact same year. They went in and passed other laws enabling manufactured consent environment. So it was, standards were affected, funding for universities was affected, laws were drafted, right? To create an environment in which you didn't have a choice. They called it consent. We'll just call it consent, but there's no choice. It's created. And I think that there's an awakening happening simultaneously with the invention of the technologies to solve the problem. And people working together to create a standard to solve it. But I think what we need to recognize is that if you allow any for-profit that's involved in this initiative, if they can make it legal to take your data and surveil you without your knowledge, they will. They have to.
Yeah, I think by and large, people don't understand the availability of technology. We had the technology to do this type of data ownership for quite some time now. I'd say probably 20 years. But it's obviously more beneficial for a lot of these companies to basically capture the value and then keep it in a database solution rather than what should be done, which is build the permissions into the data itself, right? So multi-party computation, mapped cryptographic primitives, all these things have existed for a very long time, including the standards to use those. We have been using those on actual networks for decades at this point in time. But by and large, unfortunately, we have discussions about things that don't matter, right? We need to recognize that the current topology that we allow to exist for such a long time just doesn't lend itself to provide for human agency. So what I mean by that, essentially, to simplify this massively, we are all subject to this push paradigm. I push something in front of you because of the virtue of me having a lot of data points on you and you being subject to my rules, terms and conditions, or technical or algorithmic, or usually a combination of those three. But the larger point there is obviously what we need is a pull paradigm. Right? So I want to set my objective, and based on that objective, I want to pull in the information that is conducive to my objectives. So like I always say, like if I engage with a technology, these are my overriding objectives. I want to get healthier, happier, smarter. Right? I don't want to be entertained. That's not the reason why I open up a browser. I don't want to have my time wasted. That's definitely not the reason why I opened up my browser. But I had a certain objective, and that's based on my values, and it's not based on increasing someone else's shareholder value on the other end by virtue of them just having the capability to extend some of my attention into the realm that just fosters this objective. That's just simply idiotic that we allowed that to happen, and that people don't realize that we had the technologies to reverse that for quite some time. And what we do on a daily basis, we look at these technologies that are trying to replace the existing topology, and by and large, unfortunately, entrepreneurs are utterly unable to recognize that particular landscape. Right? So they're basically doing the same thing over and over again that we already have, which, by the way, that scenario extends to most of the firms that call themselves venture capitalists, because they have a lot of cognitive dissonance built in, because they heavily invested in these legacy solutions that are database driven. And so that's why you just see more and more of that rather than less, right? If I still have a large stake in whatever it is, Uber, Facebook, you name it, well, then I have a problem. I cannot actually invest into something that will disrupt this paradigm and make these business models non-viable. To me, like an quote-unquote advertising business model doesn't deserve any protection. We should phase that out yesterday. We should move content distribution and organization to a level where it belongs, right? That's why we created .com. Move it there. You know, when you enter, this is like the commercial world. You might be social engineered. There's a warning, just like on a pack of cigarettes. If you inhale that, you might get cancer. It's like, okay, you're entering the Facebook world, and you might be social engineered into having your opinion changed from something more nuanced to something more radical. But we're not doing that, and that's a lack of education by and large, unfortunately, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the whole ad agency, the whole advertising system, we really don't need it. You know, the technologies exist for us to do micropayments, to do almost zero kind of digital cash. There's cryptographic devices like blockchains. There's many of them with all kinds of interesting properties, and we can facilitate micropayments that are cash-like peer-to-peer. We can assert self-sovereign identity. You know, we have the building blocks for a new version of the internet, a new version of our digital lives that we didn't have 10, 15 years ago. You know, the internet was built without state and without identity. It was meant to be sort of anonymous and read-only, frankly. And we've been missing the standards to catch up to the commercial viability of the internet. And the technology and the standards exist. I think that over the course of the next several years, we're going to see stuff like what we're doing and what other people are doing. We're not a whole solution. We're just a layer of it, a little part of it. I think that the time is right. People are receptive to thinking about how does technology and humanity interplay, and who's really in charge, and who owns what's in charge, and who's paying the owners to use it in certain ways. I think there's an awareness and awakening. I think the recent stuff with the generative AI, with all the AI stuff we're seeing on social media, I think it's an awakening. I think humanity is now realizing that we're inventing a new version of ourselves, a new digital hybrid version of ourselves. And the technology is catching up. So I think over the course of the next 2-3 years, we're going to see some really interesting alternatives. I think blockchain was just a prototype. Yeah, Chris, I know. But yeah, I mean, I think that the mathematicians have figured out that they can make 10 times more money than the programmers by creating these mathematical devices, and they're creating amazing things. Our data fabric that allows us to track all these containers acts like a digital cache. One of our use cases that we're working on, we're doing a prototype for a large industrial company that they have equipment that's expensive but very efficient. So our system is going to be able to, as it runs, mint carbon credits so that it offsets the cost of the equipment. Because what we're creating is a digital twin of the data container of the equipment, and as equipment runs, the twin mints the carbon credits. So the technology exists to do these peer-to-peer micropayments, to exert our self-sovereign identities, to organize into our own communities, which is what blockchains really are. It's a state engine for a community. All these missing parts that we didn't have 10, 15 years ago, we now have, and at the same time, we have an awakening in society that we have to pay attention to these things and learn about them. I think the world's going to change dramatically over the next 5 years, and I'm really excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, we see a lot of forcing functions on a daily basis. By the way, I love the fact that you call it a state engine, because by and large, people think that blockchains are protocols. They're not. They're state machines. The singular function is to change control over a set of bytes from A to B. If you're using it for anything more, specifically to record things, you're most likely invalidating the herd immunity of your application. You can start over. I want to address a comment of my friend Gary from SoCal. He was commenting as the solution is simple as pay a fee for privacy. A free account receives targeted ads but no name and contact info. That's an idea that I like in its generality, but I think there should always be like I hate regulation by and large. I think regulation typically leads to unforeseen consequences that are usually worse than the original state. But there should be a requirement, let's call it that, to surface to clients what you are worth as a platform user. So i.e. Facebook, I keep forgetting the number. I want to say it's $37 a quarter or something that a user generates for Facebook. So make that available and let people choose. I want to pay this amount directly, yes, and then you don't get to store any of my personal identifiable data. I get to control all of it. And so here, unfortunately, what happens is we don't even have the language to correctly describe the problem, right? So you touched on that unfortunate term identity again, and we're getting to that. That's a larger problem, actually, the problem of identity. We will get to digital solutions that interface with identity. It's just not what we're talking about in this particular discussion. We are talking about the agency distribution layer from a legal perspective. So identity would be another discipline, as in that would be BrainGate and things that actually directly interface with human consciousness. And we will see that too, which is a much larger danger. So that's why it's a little bit early to have a discussion about identity. What we need to talk about is agency attribution, as in what are the attributions that we can already measure from these digital technologies in the real world, which we're not doing by and large, right? We're not measuring that, we're not assigning correct attribution. And if and when and where these agencies are trying to do that, just like in my example earlier, these companies will build up great hurdles and create strawmans that will then kind of make people look the other way, when it should be obvious that, hey, you're measuring everything else, right? So you're measuring the different grades of the color blue that works the best for people to click on. So, but then you're not measuring any externalities. Are people happy or more outraged? And you can't do that. We know that, right? We know that Facebook started to run these experiments and could clearly see that they were effective doing that. So the obvious thing always is create the technologies just to measure that. I'm not saying like put Mark Zuckerberg into prison right away. Obviously, establish the evidence that either he knew or he should have known that these externalities existed, and that he happily looked the other way to add another billion or otherwise play with human consciousness at large. I don't know what drives him, right? I don't think money really drives him. I think based specifically on his early years, we have the comments of how he thinks about humanity at large. I think that's what's driving him. He's a hacker by nature. It's like, if I can mess with society at large, that's what I want to do. End of my fifth rant today, Jeff. We need to have like an emoji or something else jumping up and down if I go too long on my rants. But the reason being, obviously, for me, these things have been obvious for well over a decade now. And so to have these discussions over and over and over again and use these discussions in Congress where they don't even use the right words yet, it's very frustrating, right? So you never required the right vocabulary.
You know, I think Alan made a good point though, Chris, about microtransactions having a big impact on this. The premise of this session was business models, and I think when microtransactions really become mainstream, when they're more than just Apple Pay, when you can actually press a button and pay 5 cents for this and 25 cents for that.
No, let me stop you, because we looked at many business models that tried that over the past 5 years. None of them work. And the primary reason, there's a lot of different reasons. The primary reason is because it increases cognitive friction, which reduces adaptation. Right, so you have to meet people on the level of activity where they are right now. And unfortunately, we went so far down this particular rabbit hole where people expect certain services to be free. Even 5 cents, it's not about the 5 cents, right? It's about the cognitive friction that you're creating at this moment in time. Because
no, so that's what I'm saying. I think it has to change over time. But I think the fact that we can actually put those microtransactions in place will change us over time.
Yeah, no, honestly, I don't think so. I think
you can position it.
So in all, like, again, ultimately we're talking about network technologies here, right? And the different layers that people are using and for. So what it comes down to, remember, you need to put a stamp on an email. You were paid, we were metered by the minute, and now all of that, like, you don't pay anything basically for email. There's a negligible cost that the ISP or whoever you get your email from is absorbing. And the same for phone service providers. You're no longer metered by the minute. That should already be the case for all commercial activity that's digitally mitigated. So point there being is what you want to reward, and ultimately that's what I would encourage any business to build towards, is you can participate in the ultimate economic outcome, but not within that stream. You should never ever be part of that stream, and never ever insert any of your own business model in that asynchronous or synchronous communication piece. That's the problem, because that's what we're talking about. Whenever you're moving bytes around, right? We don't see any sustainable business model to be had in that realm. It's just not realistic. Aside from the fact that it's gonna take us a decade.
Chris, I'm going to interject, because
Sure.
we actually are doing this. So the way that I would say it is that, we're seeing the invalidation. There's both a legal awakening, a technology awakening, and a human awakening. And we're going to see the death of exploitive business models, where it's not, when we talk about technology controlling people, and instead flipping it over and people control technology, it's not the technology controlling people. It's the intermediaries controlling people. It's the people who are inserting themselves in between our transactions between human beings, back to that agency idea. And so what we're seeing is these exploitive, intermediary, and inflationary, extractive, intermediaries, data monopolies that solve for identity and state in an internet that didn't have them. Those business models are coming to an end. And we're seeing the emergence of new business models, right? So the micropayments aside, I'm just going to give you guys 3 emergent business models that we can now solve, and that are going to be emergent in the next, 3 to 5 years. So the first one is a quote that I'm going to read from the Chief Data Officer of the U.S. Army. He says, "Adversaries are not stealing our networks. They're stealing the data on the network." And he says, if the data isn't protected at the data level instead of at the perimeter level, we're not going to survive moving into the future. This is an emergent business model. We're going to be able to solve these kinds of problems. Another one, John Perry Barlow, the creator of the Electronic Frontier founder, the co-founder of the EFF. Back in 1994, he wrote an article for Wired magazine called The Economy of Ideas. And he says, if our digital property can be infinitely reproduced and instantaneously distributed all over the planet, without cost, without our knowledge, without it leaving our possession, how can we protect it? How are we going to get paid for the work we do with our minds? And this is a real trip. And if we can't get paid, what will assure the continued creation and distribution of such work? This is an emergent business model. And then we kind of have a third one. The crypto sort of meltdown we've seen over the last year. This gets to the heart of this one. In the digital world, and that's both Web3 and Web2, we have less integrity, agency, control, and security, with more expense, gatekeepers, fake people, fake businesses, fake assets, and fraudulent markets than ever before. Authentic people and businesses need to be able to trade peer-to-peer with integrity, without rent-seeking intermediaries, while having strong ownership and control of their digital identities and assets. This is a third business model that's emerging. But this is sort of the message, right? Is that we're seeing this shift. And it's fascinating to me how it all began a decade ago. It's played out over a decade, and now it's all back converging, where the human awakening, technology changes, and standards are all aligning around these new emergent business models. And I think that's the answer to your question.
Yeah. And John Perry's Independence of Cyberspace was actually our anthem for a while here on the channel. I mean, he's mostly correct. He was ahead of its time. He's on some aspects he's actually incorrect, observably, and that specifically has to do with commercial friction. So there is a use case for that, but it's basically as a DDoS protection mechanism. So just like how Ether was originally designed, you needed that within the network to introduce friction if, when, where the network was being exploited. But where he is wrong, obviously, is it's about intellectual property, quote unquote, right? Because by and large, you're never developing anything in a vacuum. It's all based on human activity. You actually want to foster that. And there, the cooperation mechanism, so incentivization using currencies, is actually vastly exceeded by people collaborating. So the difference between collaborating and cooperating is the cooperation requires an incentive mechanism. Collaboration is something where we work together on overriding goals based on our own motivation. And the later is the reason that you have things like Wikipedia, for example, which is this cognitive surplus that is being applied to intellectual output. And so that's why, as much as I want to see people being actually rewarded for doing intellectual work, I'm totally with you on that. It's outside of what network technology actually can facilitate. So you need to attach that to the real world economic outcome at the end of the day, which is a little bit harder to do. And it's probably an entire different show about the layers that we need to attach to the networks, like how we actually, and that's where all the value is, how we onboard, that's how I call it, real world economic activity to network technology in a useful fashion. The simplest example you can make here is, so all data that you're seeing and observing was created by humans in some shape or form. So then what you want to do is assign attribution, not in a de-anonymizing way, but in a way that if, when, where I want to de-anonymize myself as a creator of this particular information, I can do so and still stay pseudonymous if I choose to do that. But a second layer of that that's important to realize is we don't have any of these onboarding technologies today because we defer to platforms. So I'll give you one very simple example. So people think that NFTs have to do with jumping jiffies. That's utter nonsense. NFTs are a super important paradigm for every good and service that you right now are looking at. What I mean by that specifically is, for commercial activity to take place, it has to get somehow in, let's call it simplified, some distribution network, the global economic supply chain. And the global economic supply chain, just like any other network technology right now, is completely broken. 47% of the data there is inaccurate. And it's inaccurate because of mostly human intervention and the way the data is being exchanged. Larger point there is, in order to fix that, you got two options. A, you update all of our legacy infrastructure, so let's call it IoT devices that create data in a non-fungible way, where once you hand over the real world item, the digital clone gets handed over, and where this thing already exists, let's say real estate, we need to create networks, let's call them reputation networks, that then pseudonymously assign these qualities to individuals interacting with that. Just like you look at your Dash or your Uber driver, and based on the fact that she has 5-star ratings, you actually engage in a communication with that. And then there's another whole layer that we're seeing rapidly evolving right now that can actually right away invalidate nonsense, right? So right now, as I keep saying, we haven't invented the World Wide Web yet. We're still inventing it, right? What you're using is by and large what I call the digital landfill. You're constantly digging through this digital landfill to get to actual information. Google doesn't index actual information, never has. It indexes the digital landfill. There's 100 million parasites, including bots, that create this content, quote unquote, that you're looking at, specifically to fit this particular algorithm, because if you don't, you're just simply invisible.
Chris, I think we need to
I
wrap
didn't
up.
even have caffeine this morning, so I apologize. I don't know where this came from. Maybe because we didn't have a show last week and I didn't have a chance to rant. So I'm giving the keynote at a data science conference on Sunday in Los Angeles. So if you want to hear more rants and even faster clicks, shoot me an email. I'll get a bunch of free tickets for it. Only data science nerds will put on a data science conference on Sunday and when the FIFA World Cup is going on. So
Awesome.
you know who you can meet.
Well, hey, I wanted to make one last point though. Alan, the 3 business models you brought up, I thought those were very interesting. And one interesting point, all these big tech companies, including the huge ones, Facebook and Google and one, right? None of those companies have solved any of those problems.
No, they have not.
Not even close.
No. Because one of the other, I want to say something nice. There are good investors. We have some.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to say there, obviously.
Yeah, so much to say there. So yeah. So I blow it. Anyway, so
well,
what were we talking about?
We put the link to your organization into the show notes, and while we're streaming that, so I'll encourage everybody to check it out. What you're doing is needed.
Yes.
And you can let us know how we can best support you. Let's have you on another time, and then maybe on one of our other think tanks that we're working on. One of my hobbies is being chair of the Banking and Finance SIG at the Decentralized Identity Foundation, where we talk about one particular subset of these issues on a bi-weekly basis.
We'd love the connections, and we'd love to collaborate. Thank you, Chris.
Lead us out, Jeff.
All right. So, folks, hopefully we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks. Until next time, hold on to your bytes and your rights. We're looking out for you.